So this all started because you never knew your dad.
Yeah.
Who's your dad?
Charles Manson.
Charles Manson, the notorious cult leader and mastermind behind a string of brutal murders, referred to by many as the face of evil.
I've always been the kid with her head screwed on right. And then you find out your grandfather's Manson. How could my blood do something so atrocious?
I need to find out, was he born evil or was it something else?
So this is just an incredible film. I've watched it twice now. It was a lot to digest. First, I want to talk to you a little bit about, I really, really enjoyed Heart of the Wild Bunch. Tell me a little bit about where the idea came from.
The idea came from my love for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I was obsessed with the movie. Yeah. But I had been acting for a while at the time, and I was getting some strides before the pandemic hit. I was getting callbacks and producer sessions, and once the pandemic hit, it felt like all of the progress I had made took a turn, and no one was calling me back into any rooms. But I had this love for writing my whole life, and I met this screenwriting teacher and mentor who taught me how to write industry standard screenplays. But I wanted to act, so I wrote a short film based off of Butch Cassidy. I just wanted to be in like a Paul Newman type role and gender reverse the whole thing. So that was like my film school. So that was my first short film that I just kind of proved to myself I had this in me, where I could direct, act, and write. And I founded my production company, Joan of Arc Pictures, in 2021.
Any thoughts of maybe expanding on Heart of the Wild Bunch?
I'd love to. I'm really fascinated by an alternative perspective and story on women in that, in the 1800s, in that time, in that era. And I think I feel empowered by the idea that women can get on horses and make a community of their own and not have to depend on men. I think it's a fun idea.
Me too. So I am curious, the movie goes back to our long cinematic love of Westerns, but it also touches on our fascination with outlaws and people who've lived life on the edge on their own terms. And I'm curious, looking at that, if you were to revisit it, how has your experience with learning about who your grandfather was and making this documentary, how has that affected your interest in telling stories about outlaws, and how might it be different now if you were to approach it again?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, because if you ask me what my Letterboxd top 4 is, I didn't plan for this. I put Cool Hand Luke, Butch Cassidy, Paper Moon, and The Sound of Music as my top 4. And all of them are outlaws in their own right, even in The Sound of Music when Captain Von Trapp rips the Nazi flag, because he's making himself an outlaw by staying true to what he believes in. And I think, yeah, it's strange to now know who my grandfather is and know that he was a criminal and an outlaw his entire life before he became infamous. But I think I've learned a lot about the prison system and criminal code, like how it's a very real thing. And I can now approach that subject matter with more knowledge and I don't want to say firsthand account, because I've never involved myself in any type of crime and whatnot, but I've interviewed enough people who have been, and it's really fascinating to hear, what got them to that place. And I think as a writer, director, performer, it's essential that you do that sort of groundwork, that research. And so this was just research for me to, if I choose to go in that direction and continue making stories like that.
So the documentary is premiering this week. It's such a personal and powerful story. I'm curious, what made you decide to make this journey into a film? And did you ever have second thoughts about making something so personal?
Yes. I think I found out who my grandfather was May of 2022, and by the end of that year, I realized I wanted to make a documentary, and I had a story to tell, and I didn't know if that was going to be a docu-series or a feature film, but I decided I needed to make something out of the thing that I've inherited in my lap. There was no alternative. My co-director said the other day to someone else, it's like Taylor Swift, you'll know Taylor Swift will write about a breakup just as I would, make a film out of my own personal journey. It just was innate within me, I think, to be open and vulnerable. I grew up a pretty lonely kid. I had my dad half the time and my mom the other half, and my dad made me feel less lonely, but I grew up very quiet and very lonely and not many people to talk to. And so by the time I was 22, I still didn't have that really solid foundation of people around me. And I felt like the only way to cope with the information was to make something out of it. And I think that's what all artists do. It just so happens to be like this thing is so infamous. So it might be hard for people to believe, but if my grandfather wasn't Charles Manson and it was some other guy who had an interesting story and who was an outlaw, who my dad really looks a lot alike, I would have made the movie still. It just happened to be someone so infamous.
Well, yeah, I totally believe you on that because ultimately the thing about this is that this is your story. This is not Charles Manson's story. This isn't anyone else's. This is your story that you're telling. So regardless of who your grandfather was, absolutely. Um, in the film, especially in the interview with Stephen Kay, um, it's brought up, but you allude to the idea that other people have brought it up, the question of whether you're an apologist. Um, and I don't see it as an apologist film at all. I do think that there is an element of humanizing to it. And that's a word that some people might balk at the idea of humanizing Charles Manson, but I think it's a good thing, regardless of what your view of him is. Throughout the long history of the story being told and the mythologies that have arisen around him, he's always been dehumanized from every side, whether it was people building him up to something greater than a human or portraying him as something less than human or monstrous. But he was a person, we all are, and I think that dehumanizing anyone is a crime against truth and our own understanding if we're going to try and make a better world and learn from and make sense out of tragedies like this. What are your thoughts? Do you feel it humanizes him at all?
Yeah, the apologist thing comes up, and I've heard sympathist, Manson sympathist, and I've heard trying to justify his actions, and those are all ideas that I definitely reject, and I'm glad you can see that, and I think most people will, who are critical thinkers, obviously. But it's humanizing and it's desensationalizing is what my therapist taught me. It wouldn't have done me any good to inherit sensational wounds. I had to find out exactly what wounds I needed to heal. In order for me to know what wounds I needed to heal, I did have to talk to everybody, investigate as much as I could. That's how I got empowered with knowledge. So it was essential for me to talk to a Stephen Kay. It was essential for me to talk to a guy who was an convict, and members of the family. I think it's important work to understand what really happens in egregious cases like this, so that we can stop the cycles of abuse. And I think that's my number one North Star. Is even before I found out who my grandfather was, I had this thing I would tell myself, which was, I want to do as much good as I can in this lifetime. And I didn't know what that exactly meant for me. I didn't know how I would, come to realize that dream of mine. But if we want to break cycles of abuse and atrocious things from happening, we do have to look at the root cause, and we do have to look at the complications of humanity. I think the case of Charles Manson and making him a monster wrapped it up really neatly in a bow. This guy is evil, and this is why it happened. That wasn't going to be helpful for me to break generational wounds. I needed to know exactly what I was breaking and what I was really inheriting. So I'm glad that came through, because I believe he should have gone to prison no matter what. And he did, and he spent the rest of his life in prison for what he was guilty and culpable of. But I'll let other people decide how they feel about his infamy. And, I have my own opinions, and I'm not here to tell anyone, what to think.
And that's something that's very clear with the documentary is that you are not forcing your views on anyone, nor are you letting other views be forced on you. And that's a very powerful. I love what you said. That idea of the monster is not going to help. Not only is it not going to help heal generational wounds, it's not going to help us anytime we classify someone as a monster. That it does not help us in preventing bad things from happening again. In fact, it makes it easier because we don't understand the root causes. And I do have to say, something that I loved about the film that was very powerful to me, elements of his story that I hadn't gotten before, but I already believed in, that I hope people will really take away from this film, is that we have got to stop the cycle of letting our prison system create criminals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you tell that story beautifully. It's very, very powerful. So I think that any movie really takes shape in the editing process, and a documentary even more so, because ultimately you don't really know what movie you're making until you start cutting it together with a doc. What did you kind of discover about the story during editing that maybe changed the way you viewed the film?
This is my first documentary. So, and I've, the saying goes, like, the movie is made 3 times. It's made in pre-production, it's made when you're in filming, and it's made in post. So you're right, the movie did form in post, but we also wrote so many outlines that had to get approved by Hulu, and so many notes came back from Hulu's side on that outline. So I kind of did know what story we wanted to tell and how it was going to shape as we were moving along in the filming. I think the thing that was most uncertain was my ending. Like, how are we going to wrap this up nicely with Sophia's journey? And that came in the editing room, but also putting together, like, the therapy sessions I had with Dr. Rose, where she tells me, your dad loved you, but he did kind of groom you to carry his victimhood. With that, and combined with the childhood video of our car scene, our car fight, and the adult life car fight, like, the same sort of fight happened. I didn't remember that childhood car fight. So I gave them a hard drive of all these childhood videos my dad had given me. Most of them were so loving and so great, and stuff that I remember. And I do remember my dad had tiffs. My dad and we would fight once in a while, and he could get, verbally, not so great. But that really shaped in the post-production process because we saw parallels between adult life car fight, childhood car fight, and then therapy. So I think with all the Manson stuff, I knew how that was going to shape out to be. But with my dad and I's relationship, I was very much processing in real time and in post. And that was great. That was really great to have a co-director in there with me because I can't edit. I only learned how to like make selects. I watched all the footage and I made selects of my favorite pieces from interviews and things. And I was always, giving notes on cuts and stuff. But I was also like dealing with really mentally and emotionally vulnerable states in post-production, particularly because it was like, all my life trauma, good and bad, like the worst of the worst and the best of my dad is being seen in this movie, and this is like very difficult for me to watch. It takes me back to a place that's not so great. So it was good to have like a support system where other people could be in the editing room every day, and I got to take breaks here and there. But for the most part, the Manson stuff I could picture, and I knew what story that was going to be. The relationship between Dad and I was still processing in real time, the therapy, and then looking at those childhood videos.
Absolutely. It's interesting to me. I got connected to you through my association with Gavin Brivik,
Yeah.
who's just an incredible talent, and I met him because I do a lot of coverage for the Pit, and a big thing that I've been doing is really exploring the mental health
Yeah.
subject on that show. And people have been surprised when they heard that I was doing this interview because they're like, but you don't like true crime.
Yeah.
And my answer has been, this is not a true crime documentary.
Yeah.
This is a story about the journey of mental health.
Yeah.
Thank you for making a movie that has such powerful, relatable things to say about that.
Thank you. I'll say when I pitched to Hulu, I told them I don't like true crime and I don't want to make a true crime documentary. I don't like recreations of crimes being committed. I don't want to re-harm the victims that have already been re-victimized over and over again. And they were a great network to be partnered with in this because they supported that mental health journey, had me in therapy consistently, let me go to Indiana boys school to see, the experiences my grandfather had and how it related to my dad, because that is a generational trauma that I've inherited. And going to have Dr. Shug, do the Rorschach ink blot tests, seeing, it's not necessarily said in the documentary, but like there's a lot of talk about Manson being schizophrenic. He was schizotypal. What's schizotypal versus what's schizophrenic? Knowing those, like the vocabulary words of what you've inherited, parentified child, groomed to inherit victimness, or knowing what my grandfather might have hypomania and bipolar, it grounds this thing in reality and makes it tangible for me to be aware of, whereas Spawn of Satan doesn't. Mm-hmm. So I needed something tangible to hold on to for me to know what I was inheriting and what to shift about my life. And so thank you for seeing that, and thank you for validating that experience, because that definitely was mine.
You are an amazing artist and a very special person, and it's been an honor speaking to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Sending hugs and love.